The silence in the federal courtroom was a heavy, suffocating blanket. From my seat in the back row, I watched my older sister Megan, the family's dazzling socialite, who sat at the defendant's table looking entirely unconcerned. She leaned over to her lawyer, sharing a smirk that radiated pure, unshakable arrogance. When her eyes found mine, that smirk widened into a look of pitying condescension, the same one she'd perfected over 2 decades. It was a look that said, "Oh, you came to see my big day? How cute." Then a bailiff's voice sliced through the tension, loud and absolute. "All rise. The court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Marion Albright presiding." He took a breath, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on me. "The official observer from the Department of Defense is present, announcing Brigadier General Olivia Carter, United States Army." The title hung in the air, a shockwave of sound. I saw Megan's smile not just vanish, it was ripped from her face, replaced by a mask of slack-jawed, bone-deep horror. Her entire reality seemed to crumble in that single, shattering moment. The woman who built her life on perception was just confronted by an irrefutable fact. That moment was seeded 3 years earlier, at a loud family dinner celebrating Megan's latest triumph. She had landed a huge client, and the praise was flowing. I was home on a rare leave from what they all believed was a dead-end administrative job, a story I never corrected. When I tried to offer a simple congratulations, Megan just waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, thanks, Jess. It's complicated. A lot of high-level networking, you know, not exactly sorting paperwork in some government basement." My father, a man who measured his children's worth in public achievements, chuckled from the head of the table. "Let her have this, Olivia. Megan's out there making a name for herself. We can't all be superstars." I felt a familiar coldness settle in my stomach. The sting was made sharper because sitting right there was Colonel Evans, a family friend and my secret mentor, who knew I commanded operations they couldn't even imagine. He gave me a brief, frustrated glance, a silent acknowledgement of the farce. But it was Megan who delivered the final practice line, the one that had defined me for years. "I'm just glad you found something safe after you washed out of basic training. No shame in it." Megan's lie about me failing basic training had become family gospel, a convenient story to explain why I was the quiet disappointment. She had no idea that her lie, spoken before Colonel Evans, had just set a time bomb. To understand the reckoning that was now unfolding in that federal courtroom, you have to understand the 2 lives they forced me to live. To my family, I lived in a world of black and white, a world of failure. My narrative was written for me, authored primarily by my older sister Megan, the family's dazzling socialite and supposed business prodigy. Her life was a perfectly curated feed of success, each post a testament to her brilliance. There she was, closing a deal on a yacht, her smile as bright as the flash of the camera, #girlboss. At family gatherings, the conversation orbited around her, a planet of parental pride circling its sun. My accomplishments, the ones I could share, were met with polite, vacant smiles. They were footnotes in the grand story of Megan's rise. My parents were ghostwriters for this story. My mother, Eleanor, a woman who only saw success through a social lens, would clasp her hands and listen to Megan's stories with rapt attention. My father, Robert, a man who believed the only service that mattered was a corner office, would beam with pride. They would turn to me, their gazes softening with a familiar pity, and ask, "So, Olivia, are the government benefits any good?" It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation of my place in the family hierarchy, stable, small, and utterly unremarkable. The internal ledger would click. This was the same tone they used when I was a teenager asking for a new laptop for school, while Megan got a car for her 16th birthday. "Money is tight," they'd said then. It always was for me. The foundation of my failure was a lie they all readily accepted. The lie that I had failed basic training. It took root years ago when I came home from a brutal classified selection course. I was a wreck, ribs taped so tightly it hurt to breathe, a hairline fracture in my wrist I couldn't explain, and a deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. The truth was locked behind a non-disclosure agreement thicker than a phone book, a vow of silence I could never break. So, when Megan offered her own theory, whispered with a tone of feigned sympathy for all to hear, they seized it. "She just couldn't hack it," she'd said, shaking her head sadly. "It's okay, not everyone is cut out for it." They believed her, instantly. There was no questioning, no concern, just a quiet acceptance, because it was easier. A daughter who tried and failed was a narrative that fit their worldview far better than a daughter who disappeared into a world they couldn't possibly comprehend. They needed me to be the failure so Megan could be the star, and so, for their comfort, I let the lie become my shield. It was the perfect cover for a life they could never know about, a life of immense consequence lived entirely in the shadows they had cast for me. My reality wasn't a government basement, it was a place they didn't know existed. The paperwork they imagined me sorting was, in fact, highly classified signals intelligence and satellite reconnaissance data. The office was a sensitive compartmented information facility, or SCIF, a sterile, windowless vault where the air hummed with the sound of servers and encrypted communication lines. Here, I wasn't the quiet disappointment. Here, I was the authority. I would stand before a wall of screens, pointing out anomalies to senior officials that could alter global events. The discrepancy isn't in their logistics chain, I'd explain, my voice steady and clear. It's in the shell corporations they're using for material procurement. The fund transfers are masked, but the metadata tells the story. My recommendations carried immense weight. We're flagging it for a deep audit protocol under Statute 18, Section 371, I would state, not as a suggestion but as a course of action. In that room, my words had the power to launch investigations, to freeze millions of dollars in assets, to dismantle entire criminal enterprises that threatened national security. I was respected not for my social graces or my last name, but for my mind. My ability to see patterns where others saw chaos was my currency, and in that world, I was incredibly wealthy. It was a world of quiet, intense pressure, where a single analytical error could have catastrophic consequences. And I thrived in it. The architect of this secret life was a man my family knew only as a family friend. Colonel Evans, now General Evans, was the head of the Army's Strategic Oversight Command. He was a grizzled, no-nonsense man who didn't see me as Robert's quiet daughter. He saw an analyst. When I was just a lieutenant, he'd reviewed one of my reports on a developing situation and had pulled me aside. He saw past the quiet exterior and recognized the sharp, analytical mind I had worked so hard to hide from my family. He became my staunchest advocate, my mentor, pushing me into programs and positions my family would never believe I was qualified for. I remember briefing him on the procurement fraud case, the very one that would eventually lead me to that courtroom. I had spent weeks untangling a web of deceit that was siphoning millions from a defense contract. After I finished laying out the entire network of corruption, General Evans was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the network diagram I'd created. He looked at me, not with the pity of my father, but with a profound, professional respect. He tapped the screen, right on the central node of the network. "That's the ballgame," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Good work, Carter. I'll take it to the Joint Committee." For a decade, I built my career in the shadows, letting them have their narrative. I thought keeping my world separate was about protecting national security, but after that dinner, I realized it was also about protecting their comfort. The problem was, my sister's ambition was about to make her cross from her world into mine. And in my world, the rules are unforgiving. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked into a stack of routine interagency briefs that were my standard reading. The memo was from the Department of Justice, bearing their official seal. The subject line was nondescript, request for DoD liaison, corporate fraud investigation. I scanned the preliminary findings, the technical language of financial crimes, the dry details of shell corporations and falsified invoices, all familiar territory. Then, my eyes landed on a name listed under primary defendant, and the air in my quiet office seemed to thin and grow cold. Megan Carter. My finger traced the letters of her name on the page, Megan. It looked so out of place, a name from my other life, now stamped in stark black ink onto a document in this one. There was no surge of anger, no satisfying flash of vengeful fire I might have expected. Instead, a profound and chilling calm washed over me. It was the quiet hum of a complex machine locking into place, the feeling of a dozen scattered data points suddenly forming a clear, undeniable pattern. This was the intersection I never sought, but one I was uniquely qualified to handle. I thought about recusing myself. It would have been the easy path, the one that avoided the collision of my two worlds. I could pass the file to another officer and wash my hands of it. But as I sat there, the weight of 1,000 dismissive comments, of a decade spent in the shadow of her lies, settled on me not as anger, but as a purpose. Revenge would be emotional and messy. This was an opportunity for something cleaner. It was a chance for a procedural checkmate. My duty was the Department of Defense, whose trust and resources had been compromised, and I decided, in that moment, to perform my duty with absolute professionalism. The fact that my presence would reveal the truth to my family was simply an unavoidable and fitting consequence. I walked into General Evans' office and placed the file on his desk without a word. He read the summary, his expression unreadable as always. He didn't ask if I could handle it. He didn't mention the personal connection. He just looked up at me, his eyes holding no surprise, only resolve. "The department requires our best observer on this," he stated simply. "You're the one for the job." It wasn't a question. It was an order, and a vote of confidence that erased years of my family's doubt in a single sentence. That afternoon, I filed the official paperwork through the proper channels. The notice of official presence was a standard form, a piece of bureaucratic procedure. It was not a grand gesture, it was me, following the rules. The system my family mocked was the very system I had mastered. Megan had built her life on a foundation of lies and perception. I had built mine on procedure and fact. As I signed the official notice, I knew she would be walking into that courtroom to be judged by the law. She had no idea she was also about to be judged by the truth. Walking into the federal courtroom felt like entering a different state of matter. The air was thick and heavy, a stale mix of polished wood, old paper, and palpable anxiety. It was a place where careers and lives were unmade, and the tension was a living thing. And there they were, seated in the front row of the gallery as if holding court themselves. My family. My father, Robert, had his jaw set in a look of defiant worry, a man unaccustomed to his family name being associated with failure of any kind. Beside him, my mother, Eleanor, clutched her expensive purse like a life raft, her expression a tight mask of social terror. They were there for Megan, their brilliant, shining star, who had surely been caught in some terrible misunderstanding. They glanced back and saw me standing by the door. I saw the familiar flicker in their eyes. It wasn't a relief, and it wasn't welcome. It was confusion, bordering on annoyance, as if my presence as the family failure was just another small humiliation they had to endure on this already difficult day. They swapped a look I knew, and my own name. What is she doing here? They were thinking. They assumed I was there to offer my quiet, insignificant support. They assumed I was there for them. They had no idea I was there for the United States government. I didn't acknowledge them. To do so would have been a lie, a final performance in a play I was no longer a part of. Instead, I walked down the side aisle, my boots making no sound on the worn carpet. My service uniform was immaculate, the medals on my chest a story they had never bothered to read. My posture was perfect, not out of arrogance, but out of a decade of discipline they had dismissed as a pointless hobby. I took my designated seat in the area reserved for official counsel and observers, a seat that put me several rows behind my family, but directly in the sightline of the judge's bench. The low murmur of the room began to die down as the bailiff moved to the front. From the defendant's table, Megan caught my eye one last time. She gave me that smile, the one I knew so well, the one reserved for the hired help and disappointing little sisters. It was a final, parting gift of condescension. Then the bailiff's voice boomed, and the world shifted on its axis. "All rise." A shuffle of feet, a rustle of clothing, and then a profound silence. The bailiff cleared his throat. "The court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Marion Albright presiding." He paused, picking up a formal notice from his desk. His eyes scanned the room, found me, and he continued with practiced authority. "The official observer from the Department of Defense is present. Announcing Brigadier General Olivia Carter, United States Army." The name hit the air like a physical force. Brigadier General. Not Olivia. Not Jess. A title. A rank. An earthquake that ruptured the very foundation of my family's universe. I saw the prosecuting attorneys, who had been briefed on my attendance, give me a subtle, deferential nod. I saw the judge, a formidable woman with sharp eyes, look directly at me and incline her head in a formal acknowledgement of my position. But my focus, my entire attention, was on the three people in the front row who had written my story for me. It was time for them to read the ending. I watched my father, the man who worshipped at the altar of power and status, who believed a man's worth was measured by the title on his business card, go pale. The color drained from his face as if a plug had been pulled, leaving behind a slack-jawed, ashen mask of disbelief. He was a man who understood hierarchy, and in that instant, the hierarchy he had so carefully constructed in his own home was not just upended, it was obliterated. For his entire life he had looked down on me. Now, in a world he couldn't access, I held a rank that demanded his respect. My mother's reaction was pure social horror. Her hand flew to her mouth, a reflexive gesture to stifle the gasp that had escaped her. I could see the frantic calculations behind her eyes, the confusion, the shame. The daughter she had pitied, the one she had apologized for at cocktail parties, was a figure of authority in a federal courtroom. The narrative she had carefully maintained for her friends, for her society, had just been publicly and irrevocably dismantled. She wasn't looking at her daughter, she was looking at a social catastrophe. And Megan, she just froze. The pitying smirk was gone, a ghost of an expression on a face that was now a perfect tableau of shock. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Her eyes were locked on mine, wide with a dawning, terrifying understanding. It was the face of someone who had built her entire castle on a single solid lie, my failure, and had just watched that foundation turn to dust. Every joke, every condescending comment, every dismissive wave of her hand. All of it was now replaying in her mind, but this time the punchline was her own spectacular public humiliation. As if to seal their fate, Judge Albright spoke, her voice crisp and authoritative. "General Carter," she said, her words echoing in the stunned silence. "The court acknowledges your presence. We appreciate the department's cooperation." The word general was a hammer blow. It was the official stamp on the truth, delivered by an impartial and absolute authority. It was real. It was undeniable. And it broke them. My sister had spent her life trying to make her name known. In the end, it was my name, and the title I had earned in silence, that left the entire room speechless. When the judge called a recess, the tension in the courtroom finally snapped. The silence was replaced by a wave of hushed murmurs and shuffling feet. I stood to leave, and that's when I saw them, making their way toward me through the crowd. My parents. They looked like ghosts from a life I no longer lived, their faces a pale, horrified mixture of confusion and a dawning, terrible shame. They had the look of people who had just been ejected from their own comfortable reality and found themselves in a cold foreign land where they didn't know the language. They were utterly lost. My mother reached me first, her hand hovering in the air, as if she wanted to touch my arm but was suddenly afraid to. "Olivia," she began, her voice a reedy, broken whisper. "Olivia, we didn't know." My father stood behind her, his face ashen, the arrogant defiance completely gone, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. He looked like a man who had just discovered his entire life's ledger was written in red ink. I looked from my mother's pleading face to my father's blankness. There were no more words to be said. We had a decade of unsaid words between us, and adding more now would be like adding a single drop of rain to an ocean. I simply gave them a brief, professional nod, the kind one gives to a stranger in a corridor, and turned away to speak with the lead prosecutor, who was waiting to discuss the next steps. I didn't look back. They were irrelevant to my duty. 6 months later, the world had settled into a new alignment. The trial was a matter of public record, Megan's conviction secured by a mountain of evidence my team had helped uncover. Her fraudulent enterprise, once the source of so much family pride, had been completely dismantled. My own world had been rebuilt. My new office was larger, a corner suite in the federal building with a sweeping view of the Pentagon. It was a constant, solid reminder of the world I had chosen, and the world that had chosen me back. My new official title was long and full of bureaucratic language, but it meant one thing: I was now leading the permanent DOJ Joint Task Force on contract fraud. The very thing I was once accused of being unqualified for was now my command. My days were no longer spent in silent frustration, but in active, collaborative leadership. My team, my real team, sat around the polished briefing table. Sharp, dedicated investigators, analysts, and lawyers I hand-picked myself. They were my new family. Here, respect wasn't given out of obligation. It was earned with every accurate analysis, with every insightful question, with every late night spent chasing down a lead. The conversations were not about feelings or perceptions. They were about facts, evidence, and mission objectives. We spoke a shared language of operational integrity and procedural justice. This was a family forged not in blood, but in competence. It was a foundation of mutual respect, a stark and welcome contrast to the dysfunctional obligations of my past. We were in the middle of mapping out a complex new case, the energy in the room focused and intense, when my personal phone buzzed on the edge of the table. I glanced at it, expecting a routine notification, but it was a text from a number I still knew by heart. My mother. It was a novel, a long, rambling wall of text filled with excuses, with deflections, with a history rewritten to paint them as victims of my secrecy. It was a masterpiece of self-pity disguised as an apology, a desperate attempt to reclaim some part of me now that my status was something they could be proud of. It ended with the 5 words that were 20 years too late. "We are so proud of you, General." I read the words, and I felt nothing. Not a spark of anger, not a flicker of triumph. Just the quiet, peaceful emptiness of a space that had once been filled with a constant, aching pain. The wound had finally healed over, leaving smooth, solid ground where there had once been a crater. That text message was a ghost, a faint echo from a world that no longer had any power over me. My thumb hovered over the screen, over the last remnants of that old life, over the final, pathetic entry in a ledger that was now closed. And I pressed archive. I placed the phone face down on the table, took a deep breath of the clear, calm air in my new world, and turned back to my team. My focus was unbroken. I was home. My sister gave me a reputation I never asked for. In the end, I made her and my entire family face the title I earned. If you've ever had to build your own worth while others were trying to tear it down, share your story below. In this community, your rank is always recognized.